It's gone 6. The deadline has expired. Now the world waits for war. Iraq remains defiant to the end. An effigy of Bush burns in Baghdad. A Kiwi contribution. Medics fly out to patch up the war wounded. And the partial eclipse. The moon does a slow waltz across the sun.
One Network News with Angela Dordney and Greg Clark.
Good evening. It's now a few seconds after 6 o'clock, the time set by the United Nations for Iraq to quit Kuwait. This means the American-led forces can now go to war. There's no sign yet of any action except one US television report which says American forces have begun jamming Iraqi communications, an action which usually precedes an attack. All diplomatic attempts to avert a Gulf conflict ended today, but final pleas were made from all parts of the globe. UN Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar said, "I most sincerely appeal to President Saddam Hussein to turn the course of events away from catastrophe." Britain's Prime Minister John Major told the House of Commons, "We do not want a conflict. We're not thirsting for war, though if it comes, it will be a just war." And King Hussein of Jordan warned Arab leaders, "Our region today is facing a deep abyss. A destructive war is about to begin." We have extensive coverage of this crucial day, and we begin with the desperate but futile diplomatic attempts to avoid a conflict. Michael Wilson reports.
As protest ranks swelled outside UN headquarters in New York, inside Security Council members grappled with last-minute peace proposals. A French plan tabled last night linked an Iraqi withdrawal with a Middle East peace conference on the Palestinian question. But the Americans and British immediately rejected it, and after hours of debate, even the Iraqis said no. Eventually, French Foreign Minister Dumas was forced to concede defeat.
Not to Baghdad.
Not to Baghdad, no. As you can see, I'm still in Paris.
Prime Minister Michel Rocard reinforced the gravity of the situation.
France cannot shirk her responsibilities and cannot accept that might triumphs over right.
Britain suggested the UN Security Council send one final joint political appeal to Iraq. But members couldn't agree, and Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar was left to make a last plea alone.
Every effort will be made to address, in a comprehensive manner, the Arab-Israeli conflict, including the Palestinian question.
In Washington, President Bush convened his War Council. And though war was the focus of discussions, he refused to be drawn on questions about the Gulf crisis.
I'm waiting to hear from our economic experts and team and independents about what's happening in the economy.
When he does decide to order military action, Mr. Bush will contact King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, the country that's playing host to most of the Allied troops. Next comes Britain's John Major, Egypt's President Mubarak, then President Mitterrand of France, who will contact President Gorbachev and Mr. Shamir, the Israeli Prime Minister. Whenever the call comes, it's unlikely to be immediate. The UN deadline expires at 8 a.m. Iraqi time. The Allied commanders believe their high-tech equipment gives them an advantage at night, so they're likely to wait till darkness falls before they strike. Michael Wilson, One Network News.
Saddam Hussein was today personally making sure his men would be ready for that attack. He occupied Kuwait, telling his troops there would be no compromise on the rights of Iraq and the Arab nations. Back in the Iraqi capital, a likely target if war breaks out, the mood was tense.
Tonight, they're preparing in earnest for war here. The last diplomatic initiative, the French one, has been undercut by Iraq's point-blank refusal to withdraw from Kuwait. The Information Minister, Latif Jassim, invited the BBC and other news organizations still represented here to tell us that the processes of diplomacy had come to an end.
We are not looking for initiative. We are fully prepared now for confrontation and for crushing the evil head.
He repeated with greater menace than before that if and when the Americans attacked Iraq, Iraq would strike at Israel. And as he left, he said, "Pity Bush." Ever since early morning, the streets of Baghdad have been strangely silent today. 5 out of every 6 shops were closed. In one of the main shopping areas, Rashid Street, a seller of fruit juice, was one of the few shopkeepers who'd opened. He maintained that the shops were shut because of the big demonstrations in various parts of the city. The Ba'ath Party organizers, in their green uniforms, were instructed by the National Assembly yesterday to encourage as many people as possible to turn out this morning. There was everything you might expect in a demonstration by people who faced the likelihood of an all-out attack by their country's enemies. They burned an effigy of George Bush, for instance. But what was missing was any sense of menace or rage. It was certainly skillfully organized. As each group passed the platform where the photographers and cameramen were, they danced and chanted with particular fervor. The photographers concentrated on that, without noticing how quiet things were on the edge of the crowd. So there seems to be nothing now except the prospect of war here. It's a war which Iraq's president believes he can win, despite the technological advantages of the Americans and their allies. Tonight, ominously, they were testing the air raid sirens here.
Britain is America's biggest ally in the Gulf, but even though it had committed thousands of troops and a full range of military hardware to the Middle East, Parliament sanctioned going to war only hours before the United Nations deadline expired. Our European correspondent Liam Giori reports.
Although Britain has the second largest Western force in the Gulf after the Americans, Parliament never voted on whether or not to fight, a decision that outraged some MPs.
This is not the mother of Parliament, if this is the way we do our business. It's just a blanket for the executive to do whatever it wishes.
So on the last day before the deadline, MPs debated the issue, even as some of them brushed off powdered paint signifying blood and hurled at them by protesters in the galleries above.
We do not want a conflict. We are not thirsting for war. Though if it comes, I must say to the House, I believe it would be a just war.
With that being the prevailing attitude of the politicians, the frustration of the anti-war lobby boiled over, some protesters chaining themselves to the gates of number 10 Downing Street. But their anti-war sentiments mean little in this country, where some of the newspapers have declared war before it's even begun, where jingoism is the norm. The great fear in Europe is of terrorist attacks. As far as Iraq is concerned, Britain is a target second only to the United States. More than 100 Iraqis have been expelled so far, including most of the diplomats from the embassy here in London, and the anti-terrorist squad has doubled its surveillance of known pro-Saddam sympathisers. British airports are considered the prime targets for terrorists, so naturally security has been beefed up. These days they are positively bristling with armed policemen. And tour operators are telling an estimated 5,000 British holidaymakers to come home from Cyprus and North Africa immediately. Those who stay on do so at their own risk. The people of Great Britain know they're heading for a war. In minutes they may already be in one. Those who gathered in Trafalgar Square overnight believe the only thing left to do now is pray.